The summer of 1964 in Hollow Creek was like any other. The thick humidity clung to everything, from the worn wooden porches to the cracked asphalt roads that cut through the town. Cicadas droned endlessly from the trees, and the only reprieve from the heat was the occasional evening breeze that carried the scent of honeysuckle and gasoline. Grandpa William Kane was 24 at the time. Back then, he was just Will to everyone who knew him. He spent most of his days working at the local garage, fixing up old trucks and the occasional tractor. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, he would retreat to the small house he had inherited from his father. It wasn't much, but it was his, tucked away on the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that stretched for miles. Will had a routine: finish work, grab a beer, and settle into his garage to tinker with his own projects. He found comfort in the hum of machinery, the rhythmic clicking of his tools, and the familiar crackle of his old radio. That radio was his companion, broadcasting everything from music to late-night talk shows that kept him company in the solitude of his garage. He could work for hours, lost in the melody of guitar riffs and drum beats, the garage lit by the soft glow of a single overhead bulb. But one night, everything changed. It was a Friday in mid-August, and Will had just finished up a long day at the garage. The sky had turned from bright blue to the deep purples and oranges of twilight, and the air had finally cooled enough to be bearable. After a quick dinner of canned beans and toast, Will wandered back to the garage to continue working on an old Harley he'd been restoring for weeks. The radio sat in its usual spot on a shelf near the workbench, playing a rock station that Will always listened to. The music filled the small space, mingling with the clatter of wrenches and the scent of motor oil. At exactly midnight, the music stopped. The abruptness of the silence startled Will, causing him to drop a bolt he'd been tightening. He cursed under his breath, wiping his greasy hands on a rag as he walked over to the radio. Static hissed from the speakers, a grating sound that filled the room like a thick fog. Will frowned and twisted the dial, assuming the station had gone down or the signal had been lost. The static shifted, wavering, as though something was trying to break through. And then he heard it, a voice, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was low, gravelly, and spoke with an odd cadence that sent a shiver down Will's spine. He leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. William Kane. Will froze. His heart seemed to stutter in his chest. It wasn't possible. No one should have known his name, not on a broadcast like this. It had to be some kind of trick, maybe a prank from the station. He adjusted the dial again, trying to change the frequency, but the voice persisted. William Kane. You. The rest of the sentence was lost to the static, but Will didn't need to hear it. He reached for the power switch, flipping the radio off. The room fell silent once more, and he stood there for a moment, listening to his own shallow breaths. The rational part of his mind told him it was just a coincidence. Maybe a stray signal bleeding through from another station. Radios did that sometimes, but still, his hands trembled as he stepped away from the workbench. Just as he was about to head inside, the radio flicked back on by itself. The static was gone now, replaced by that voice. Closer, clearer, as if it were no longer coming from the radio, but from somewhere in the room. You cannot escape, William. The air in the garage seemed to thicken, growing cold despite the lingering summer heat. Will's breath caught in his throat. He stood rooted to the spot, too terrified to move. He scanned the room for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. but nothing was out of place, and the radio, despite being off, continued to broadcast that eerie voice. William. Death. The word echoed in the silence like a gunshot. Will's blood ran cold. Without thinking, he yanked the plug from the wall, the force of it sending the radio crashing to the floor. It shattered on impact, pieces of it scattering across the concrete. The voice finally stopped. The garage was silent again. Only the faint hum of the cicadas outside broke the quiet. Will stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the broken radio, his mind racing. What had just happened? It wasn't normal. It couldn't have been. But he had no explanation. Shaken, he turned on his heel and left the garage, locking the door behind him as though that could somehow keep the strange voice out. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear that voice again, whispering his name, repeating that same terrible word, death. It lingered in his mind, replaying over and over like a record stuck on repeat. When dawn finally came, Will woke up feeling more exhausted than when he had gone to bed. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that he had imagined the whole thing, that maybe he had fallen asleep at his workbench and dreamed it. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The voice had been real, and somehow it had known his name. In the days that followed, Will avoided the garage. He told himself it was because he needed a break from work, but in truth, he couldn't bring himself to go back to the place where he'd heard the voice. But the more he tried to distance himself from the event, the more it seemed to creep into his life. Radios in the house would flicker on and off by themselves, even when they weren't plugged in. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd hear faint whispers seeping through the walls, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably there. Will was a rational man, a man of machines and engines. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, and he certainly didn't believe in the supernatural. But whatever had happened that night wasn't normal. It wasn't just in his head. Something had spoken to him, something beyond explanation. And whatever it wasn't done with him yet. As the weeks wore on, Will could feel it growing, an invisible presence, always lurking just at the edges of his awareness. He caught glimpses of it in the corners of his vision, shadows that didn't belong, figures that seemed to shift and vanish the moment he turned his head. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was just his imagination, but deep down he knew the truth. Something had been unleashed that night in the garage, something that had attached itself to him, and no matter how hard he tried to escape it, it wasn't going to let him go. The radio broadcast had been the beginning, the first warning, and as much as Will wanted to believe it had all been a mistake, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had spoken to him was still out there, waiting in the darkness, biding its time, and the next time it spoke, it wouldn't be through a broken radio. It didn't take long after the first broadcast for things to spiral out of control. My grandpa, Will Kane, would later tell me that after that night in the garage, the feeling of being watched grew more intense with each passing day. It started subtly, a sense of unease, a cold prickle on the back of his neck, as if someone was standing just behind him, watching, waiting. He told himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him after that eerie night. But soon it became impossible to ignore. The whispers began to invade his home. It was always late at night, in the moments just before sleep when the house was at its quietest. The whispers would crawl through the silence like snakes slithering beneath the floorboards. At first, it was nothing but faint murmurs, impossible to decipher, like voices heard through a wall. But gradually they became clearer, more insistent, until he could make out certain phrases that sent chills down his spine. "You cannot run, William. It watches you. We are coming." Will would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, heart racing as though he'd just run for miles. He would search the house, flicking on every light, checking every door and window. But there was never anyone there, no intruders, no evidence of anyone in the house except him. Just silence, thick and oppressive, settling back into the walls as if mocking his terror. But the worst of it wasn't the whispers, it was the shadows. They started small, barely noticeable at first, a flicker in the corner of his eye, a dark smudge that would vanish as soon as he turned his head. But then they grew bolder, more distinct. At first he thought they were tricks of the light, perhaps shadows cast by trees swaying outside his window or the dim lighting in his home. But soon they began to take shape. One night, Will was sitting in his living room trying to distract himself with an old war movie on TV when he saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, almost humanoid, lingering in the hallway just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't moving, it simply stood there, watching him. Will's body tensed, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, thinking it would disappear like the others, but this one didn't fade. It remained. He felt the cold touch of fear grip his heart. For a long moment he couldn't bring himself to move. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the presence of whatever was standing there, just out of reach. The shadow had no features, no face, but it radiated a malevolence that made his skin crawl. It was as if it were waiting for him to acknowledge it, daring him to react. When he finally managed to pull himself to his feet, his legs felt like lead. Slowly, he reached for the lamp on the side table and switched it on, flooding the hallway with light. The shadow vanished instantly, dissolving into nothing as if it had never been there. But Will knew better. It had been there. It was real, and it wasn't alone. After that, the shadows began to follow him everywhere. He'd see them in the mirror while brushing his teeth, just behind him in the reflection, only for them to disappear when he turned around. They lingered in the corners of rooms, dark smudges that seemed to shift and pulse like living things. And they were always watching, always waiting. The paranoia began to take its toll on Will. His days became a blur of anxiety and fear. He hardly slept anymore, and when he did, the nightmares were worse than the reality. Dreams of being trapped in a vast, shadowy void where unseen hands reached out from the darkness, grasping at him, pulling him into their cold embrace. He would wake up gasping for air, certain that something had been in the room with him. His work began to suffer too. He became distracted, distant, jumping at the smallest sounds. The guys at the garage noticed the change in him. They asked him if he was feeling all right, but Will brushed them off with excuses. He was just tired, he said, nothing to worry about. But inside he was unraveling. It wasn't long before the shadows became more than just passive observers. One night, Will was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to sleep when he felt something shift in the room. His body stiffened as the familiar coldness crept over him, and he knew they were here. He glanced toward the doorway, and there it was again. The shadow, taller than before, more defined. It stood in the door frame, featureless yet somehow menacing. He tried to convince himself it wasn't real, that it was all in his head. But then it moved. The shadow stepped forward, gliding silently across the floor toward his bed. Will's heart thundered in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run. but he couldn't move. It was like something was holding him down, pinning him to the mattress. The shadow came closer until it stood at the foot of his bed. He could feel it looming over him, a suffocating presence that seemed to drain the air from the room. For a moment it just stood there, as if savoring his fear. Then slowly it began to reach out. Will's breath came in shallow gasps as the shadow's form shifted, its arms elongating into long, spindly tendrils that seemed to stretch toward him. He could feel the cold radiating off of it, an icy chill that seeped into his bones. His mind screamed in terror, but his body wouldn't obey. He was trapped, frozen in place as the shadow's tendrils hovered just inches from his chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow pulled back. It melted away into the darkness, dissolving like smoke in the wind, leaving Will gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. The room was empty again, the air heavy with the scent of something foul and decaying. But he knew it wasn't over. The shadow had retreated, but it would return. And the next time, he wasn't sure if he'd survive. Will spent the following days in a state of heightened paranoia. He boarded up the windows, convinced that somehow the shadows were slipping in from outside. He locked every door, checked every crevice, but it didn't help. The shadows were inside him now, rooted in his mind, waiting to resurface the moment he'd let his guard down. His friends stopped coming by, unnerved by his erratic behavior and hollow-eyed appearance. His family kept their distance, unsure of what to say or how to help him. Will's isolation deepened, and he felt as though the world was slipping away from him, bit by bit, replaced by the cold, creeping darkness that had taken hold of his life. By the time winter arrived, Will was a shadow of his former self. He rarely left the house, afraid that the shadows would follow him if he stepped outside. He couldn't trust his own mind anymore. His reflection seemed foreign to him now, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who barely resembled the person he had been just months before. The shadows had hollowed him out, filling him with their presence, until there was hardly anything left of the man he used to be. And then, one night, it all came to a head. Will woke in the dead of night to a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like the scrape of something sharp across the floor. He lay there, holding his breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, like nails dragging against the wooden boards beneath his bed. His pulse quickened. He tried to tell himself it was just the house settling, that it was nothing. But deep down, he knew better. The shadows were back. Will sat up, his eyes straining to see in the darkness. The room was colder than it had ever been, and the faintest hint of movement caught his eye. At the foot of his bed, the shadows began to gather, coalescing into a dark, writhing mass. They shifted and twisted, forming shapes that resembled limbs, arms, legs, and something that might have been a face, though it was nothing more than a void. The shadows reached for him, stretching across the bed like black smoke, tendrils wrapping around his legs, his arms, his chest. Will thrashed against them, trying to break free, but they tightened their grip, pulling him deeper into their embrace. Just as he felt himself being dragged into the darkness, he heard a sound, a voice, soft and familiar, echoing through the room. It was the same voice from the radio, the one that had haunted him for months. "William Kane," it whispered, "you belong to us." And with that, the shadows pulled him under. The winter of 1970 arrived in Hollow Creek, with an eerie stillness, the kind that made every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, feel like a threat. Snow blanketed the town in a suffocating hush, muffling sounds and isolating Will Kane even further from the outside world. The woods that surrounded his home seemed darker and more oppressive in the winter months, their skeletal branches like claws reaching for anyone foolish enough to venture too close. But even they paled in comparison to the darkness that had taken root inside Will's house. It had been months since the shadows had first appeared, and since that night when they had nearly pulled him into whatever hellish void they came from, Will had done everything in his power to push them back. But nothing worked. No amount of prayers, rituals, or locks could keep the malevolent presence at bay. The shadows had become a constant, an inevitable part of his life, always lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. And then the radio came back. He hadn't seen it since the night it had shattered in his garage after that first terrible broadcast, the one that had whispered his name and foretold his doom. Will had hoped that it had been destroyed for good. But one cold December night, as he stumbled into bed after a fitful evening of pacing the house, he found it waiting for him. The radio sat on his nightstand, pristine and polished, as though it had never been broken. Its dark wood gleamed in the dim light, the old-fashioned dials casting long shadows on the walls. Will stared at it, heart thundering in his chest. It hadn't been there before. He was certain of it. He would have noticed. But somehow it had returned, placed there as if to taunt him, a grim reminder that whatever haunted him wasn't finished. Against his better judgment, Will reached out and touched the radio's cold surface. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a shock of electricity seemed to jolt through him, freezing him in place. A low hum began to emanate from the device, a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Will yanked his hand away, but the hum continued, growing louder until it filled the room with its oppressive presence. The radio flickered to life on its own, the dial turning slowly as though guided by an invisible hand. Will backed away, his eyes wide with terror, as static crackled through the speakers, filling the room with an otherworldly noise that felt like nails on a chalkboard. He wanted to run, to escape the room and never look back, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear and the suffocating weight of the malevolent presence that had taken over his life. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the static stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence, thick, unnerving silence that pressed in on Will from all sides. And then came the voice. "William Kane," it whispered, the sound low and distorted, as though coming from a place far beyond the reach of human understanding. Will's skin prickled at the sound of it, his blood turning to ice. He hadn't heard that voice since the first broadcast, but he recognized it instantly. It was the voice that had called his name all those months ago, the voice that had marked him. "Your time is near." The words sent a shudder through Will's body. He stumbled back, his mind screaming for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The voice seemed to fill the entire room, crawling into his ears, his mind wrapping itself around his thoughts like a vice. "What do you want?" Will rasped, his voice shaking. He wasn't sure who or what he was talking to. He wasn't even sure if he was truly awake. Maybe this was just another nightmare, one of the many that had plagued him since the shadows had come into his life. The radio hissed, and then the voice came again, stronger, more insistent. "You belong to us, William Kane. You cannot escape your fate." Will clenched his fists, fighting against the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm him. "I haven't done anything," he whispered, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "I didn't ask for this." The voice responded with a low, sinister chuckle, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the room. "You have been chosen," it said. "There is no escape. The curse is upon you and it cannot be broken." A sharp pain shot through Will's skull, and he cried out, clutching his head as the voice continued to speak. But now it wasn't just one voice, it was many, a cacophony of whispers and screams, all echoing the same terrible message. "You belong to us. You cannot run. The curse will claim you." Will staggered backward, collapsing into the corner of the room, his body trembling violently as the voices swirled around him. They filled his mind, tearing at his thoughts, his memories, until he couldn't distinguish between reality and the nightmare that had taken over his life. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voices stopped. Will blinked, his vision swimming as the room seemed to steady itself. The radio was silent now, the dials still, the hum gone. The only sound was the rapid thudding of his own heartbeat, loud in his ears as he tried to catch his breath. But the reprieve was short-lived. Will felt something cold brush against his skin, like the touch of a hand made of ice. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head. One of the shadows was standing right beside him. This one was different from the others. It wasn't just a vague shape in the darkness. It was more solid, more defined. Will could see its long, spindly limbs, the way its body seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. And its face, if it could even be called that, was a twisted, featureless void, blacker than anything Will had ever seen. It leaned in closer, its presence suffocating, and Will felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest, as if it were trying to crush the very air from his lungs. The shadow raised one of its long, claw-like fingers and pointed toward the radio. Will's gaze followed, and he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Carved into the dark wood of the radio was a symbol, an ancient, twisted mark that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy. He didn't recognize it, but something deep inside him recoiled at the sight of it, as if it were a brand burned into his soul. The shadow's voice, though it didn't have a mouth, was like a rasping breath, cold and hollow. "The mark is yours now," it whispered, though Will couldn't tell if the voice came from the shadow or from the radio itself. "The message has been delivered. Your fate is sealed." Will tried to speak, tried to plead, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his mouth incapable of forming any coherent sound. The shadow loomed over him for a long moment, its presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. And then, as if satisfied with its work, it began to dissolve, fading back into the darkness from which it had emerged. The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal, and the heavy, oppressive feeling began to lift. Will was left alone in the silence, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The radio sat quietly on his nightstand, its dials lifeless once more, but Will knew that the broadcast wasn't truly over. It was only waiting for the next time it would speak. The next time it would remind him that he was bound to it, that his life was no longer his own. Will spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of his room, staring at the radio, waiting for it to come back to life. But it didn't. Not that night. But Will knew, deep down, in the pit of his soul, that the voice would return. It always did. The message had been delivered. His time was running out. And no matter how far he ran, no matter what he did, he would never escape the shadow that had claimed him. He belonged to it now. The night my grandpa disappeared, the world seemed to stop. The cold, silent winter of Hollow Creek held its breath, as if even nature itself knew that something unspeakable had finally happened. I had come to visit him after months of not seeing him, months where his voice on the phone had grown weaker, more frantic, until there were days when he wouldn't answer at all. When I arrived at the house, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The air around the house was thick with a palpable dread, the kind that settles deep in your bones, making it hard to breathe. The shadows seemed darker, the cold biting deeper. The house stood silent, looming against the backdrop of the dark woods like a grave marker. Inside, the air was stale, untouched by any sign of life. I called for him, my voice echoing in the empty rooms, but there was no answer. The house was cold, the kind of cold that felt unnatural, as though the warmth of life had been drained from the place. I wandered through the rooms, looking for him, calling his name. Every corner felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible, to reveal itself. And then I saw it. In the center of the living room, standing on the small wooden table where my grandpa used to keep his coffee and books, was the radio. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. I hadn't seen it when I first walked in. But there it stood, pristine and polished, its dark wood gleaming in the dim light like something ancient and malevolent. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite the overwhelming urge to flee. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch the radio, my breath shallow and quick. The moment my fingers brushed against the smooth surface, a sharp jolt of cold ran through me, and the radio crackled to life. I stepped back, heart hammering in my chest, as the familiar static filled the room. It was louder this time, more insistent, like a living thing that had been waiting for this very moment. I stood frozen, watching as the dials turned on their own, spinning and clicking into place as though guided by an unseen hand. And then the voice returned. William Kane. But it wasn't just addressing my grandpa anymore. The voice, low, distorted, and filled with a hollow malevolence, seemed to reach out to me as well. I could feel it pulling me in, wrapping around my mind like a suffocating blanket. The air grew thick, the shadows deepened, and the temperature in the room dropped until my breath hung in front of me in clouds of mist. "Your time has come," the voice whispered, and the words felt like they were being spoken directly into my soul. "The curse cannot be broken. You are bound to us." I shook my head, backing away from the radio, my heart pounding in my chest. "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear. "Where's my grandpa?" The radio hissed, and the voice chuckled, a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "William Kane has fulfilled his fate. Now, the time has come for you." My blood turned to ice. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. I could feel them, those shadows, moving just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting, just as they had watched my grandpa all those years. And now they were watching me. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape the house, to get away from the cursed object that had tormented my grandpa for so long. But as I turned to flee, something stopped me, something terrible. Standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its body shrouded in darkness, it stood perfectly still, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but could feel. Cold, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me like shards of glass. my breath caught in my throat, my body frozen with fear. "Grandpa?" I whispered, though I knew the truth even before the word left my lips. The figure didn't move, but the presence, the overwhelming weight of its gaze, pressed down on me, making it difficult to breathe. It wasn't my grandpa. It wasn't even human. It was something else, something far worse, something that had been waiting in the shadows all these years, feeding off the fear and despair that had consumed him. And now it was here for me. I stepped back, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard in my chest that I thought it might burst. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped in the same nightmare that had consumed my grandpa. The figure stepped closer, the shadows rippling around it like smoke, and I could feel its cold presence wrapping around me, suffocating me. The voice on the radio spoke again, soft and menacing. "You belong to us now, just as William did. The curse passes on. It cannot be escaped." The figure reached out toward me, its long, shadowy fingers stretching across the room, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, into my bones. I was drowning in the darkness, suffocating under its weight, and I knew, deep down, I would never escape. And then, in one last, desperate act of defiance, I lunged toward the radio. My hands closed around it, and with all the strength I had left, I hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, splintering into pieces, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent house. For a moment, everything went still. The shadows hesitated, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. I gasped for air, my chest heaving, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The figure in the doorway seemed to waver, flickering like a dying flame. And then, slowly, it began to fade, the shadows retreating into the corners of the room, dissolving into the darkness from which they had come. But the voice didn't disappear. It lingered, a faint whisper that seemed to echo in the very air around me. "You cannot escape. The curse remains." I collapsed onto the floor, my body weak, my mind reeling. I had destroyed the radio, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The curse wasn't gone. It had been passed on to me, just as it had been passed to my grandpa all those years ago. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to fight it, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it would claim me. I stayed there on the floor for what felt like hours, staring at the shattered remains of the radio, the weight of the curse pressing down on me like a heavy, unshakable burden. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the house creaked and groaned in the cold winter night. When I finally stood, I knew that my life would never be the same. The shadows had claimed my grandpa, and now they had claimed me. I could feel them, watching from the corners of the room, waiting. And though the radio was gone, the broadcast wasn't over. It would never be over. As I left the house that night, stepping out into the freezing darkness, I felt a presence behind me. Faint but undeniable. The shadows would follow me wherever I went. They always did. And though the voice had gone silent, I knew I would hear it again. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but someday soon. It would return, and when it did, I would be ready to face whatever final revelation the darkness had in store for me. The curse had claimed William Kane, and now it had claimed me.